When we talk about the 100 Years' War, we usually think of epic battles. Crécy with its devastating longbows, Poitiers where the Black Prince captured a king, Agincourt where Henry V defied impossible odds. But what about the wars fought in the shadows? What about the battles waged not with steel and fire, but with whispered promises and bags of gold? The real power of this conflict wasn't on the battlefield. It was in palaces, courts, and back alleys where loyalty was bought and sold like any other commodity. This wasn't just a war between nations. This was a chess game where the pieces were human lives, where loyalty was temporary. Historians love to debate the tactical innovations at Crécy, the political implications of the Treaty of Troyes, the symbolic importance of Joan of Arc's mission. But they're looking at the stage while ignoring the puppet masters pulling the strings behind the curtain. And where switching sides wasn't just acceptable, it was profitable, necessary, and often the difference between life and death. This is the tale of how two kingdoms nearly destroyed themselves, not through foreign conquest, but through internal rot, where the greatest enemies weren't across the channel, but sitting at the same table, sharing the same wine, and planning each other's destruction. This man was more of a flip-flopper than any modern politician you can name. His story reads like a medieval soap opera, complete with murder, revenge, and enough double crosses to make your head spin. The question isn't just who won, it's who betrayed whom to get there. More battles were won before they began, decided in midnight meetings and sealed with secret handshakes. More kings fell to treachery and to enemy swords. Charles VII, now firmly established as King of France, offered Philip everything the English had promised and more. Throughout France, lesser nobles played the same game with even less scruple. Take the story of the Sire de Gaucourt, who held the fortress of Harfleur. When the English besieged the town in 1415, he fought heroically, holding out for weeks until starvation forced surrender. During the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, noble families would deliberately split their loyalties, sending one son to fight for each side. The Percy family, Earls of Northumberland, had served English kings loyally for generations, holding the Scottish border against invasion. English nobles began to see the crown not as a sacred trust, but as a prize to be won through cunning and force. Bishops and abbots, who were supposed to be above worldly concerns, became some of the most skilled political operators of the age. They controlled vast wealth, maintained international networks of communication, and owed theoretical allegiance to the Pope rather than any earthly king. This made them perfect intermediaries for treacherous negotiations. The great banking houses of Florence maintained branches in both London and Paris, carefully financing both sides while taking no political position beyond profit maximization. Chronicles of the time treat switching sides as a normal part of political life, like changing clothes for the season. What would have been unthinkable treachery to an earlier generation had become standard operating procedure for medieval realpolitik. When your enemies are paying you interest on the loans they're using to fight each other, the absurdity of the entire conflict becomes clear. The seeds of the Wars of the Roses were planted not in the 1450s. He financed English campaigns while investing in French merchants, playing both sides with remarkable skill. When accused of divided loyalties, he claimed to serve God's will, which apparently involved maximizing his own temporal power. But in these early betrayals that taught the English nobility that kings could be made and unmade through conspiracy and violence, where sacred oaths lasted only until someone offered better terms, and where the concept of patriotism was a luxury only the poor could afford. Cities would declare for France in the morning and England by evening, depending on which army was closer and which commander offered better protection for their trade. But when Henry IV usurped the throne from Richard II, the Percys decided they'd backed the wrong horse. They rebelled in 1403, fighting alongside Welsh rebels and actively seeking French military support. When your own border guards are inviting foreign armies onto English soil, you know the concept of national loyalty has completely broken down. That way, regardless of who won, the family would be on the winning side. Some particularly clever houses managed to have representatives in the English camp as well, ensuring their survival no matter what happened. Henry V was so impressed by his courage that he released him on parole, trusting his word as a knight that he wouldn't fight against England for a year. Complete autonomy for Burgundy, exemption from paying homage to the French crown, and exclusive control over the lucrative trade routes between Italy and Northern Europe. Philip didn't just abandon his English allies. He actively turned against them, using his intimate knowledge of English strategy to help the French reconquer Normandy. The 100 Years' War wasn't won by the side with better soldiers. It was won by the side that better understood the price of loyalty and the profit in betrayal. His father, John the Fearless, had been assassinated on the bridge of Montereau during what was supposed to be a peace meeting with the Dauphin Charles. When confronted about breaking his parole, his response was simple. The English had failed to pay the ransom they'd promised, so the agreement was void. Apparently, medieval honor had fine print. The meeting was arranged under a flag of truce, with solemn oaths sworn on holy relics. The entire noble class had transformed loyalty from a sacred bond into a business transaction. Lords held lands from multiple overlords, collected salaries from competing armies, and changed allegiances based on whoever offered the best terms for the next campaign season. His armies fought alongside English forces. His diplomats negotiated English treaties. His gold financed English campaigns. But Philip's loyalty lasted exactly as long as it served his interests, which turned out to be until 1435, when France made him a better offer. John came expecting reconciliation and left as a corpse, hacked down by Charles's supporters, who apparently interpreted peace talks rather liberally. For over a century, from 1337 to 1453, what appeared to be a simple dynastic dispute between England and France became something far more complex and sinister. But here is the thing. Philip wasn't seeking justice or honoring his father's memory. He was securing his own power. The English offered him something the French couldn't: recognition of Burgundian independence and exclusive trading rights that would make his duchy the richest territory in Europe. The traditional narrative tells us about heroic knights charging into battle, about the evolution of military technology, about the birth of national consciousness. The real story of the 100 Years' War lies not in the grand battles that make for stirring paintings and epic poems, but in the betrayals that shaped every major turning point. While chroniclers focused on military tactics and royal proclamations, the true weapons of this war were deception, manipulation, bribery, and the calculated sacrifice of allies who had outlived their usefulness. Consider this: more territory changed hands through betrayal than through conquest. This is the story they don't teach in schools, the history that makes kings look less like heroes and more like the medieval equivalent of crime bosses. Act 1. The real fight, betrayals and shifting allegiances. Let's start with the man who turned betrayal into an art form, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. In 1419, Philip inherited his duchy under the worst possible circumstances. Philip's response was swift and calculating. Within months, he had allied himself with England through the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. For 15 years, Philip was England's most valuable ally. The Treaty of Arras was a masterpiece of medieval realpolitik. But Philip was just the most prominent example of a phenomenon that defined this war. 6 months later, Gaucourt was back in the field, leading French forces against English positions. These weren't isolated incidents of individual corruption. The French nobility had turned betrayal into a sophisticated system. But the English weren't immune to this disease of treachery. The rebellion failed, but it established a pattern. Even more cynical was the role of the church in these betrayals. Cardinal Beaufort, Henry V's great-uncle and one of the wealthiest men in Europe, simultaneously served as an English diplomat and maintained secret correspondence with French agents. The war had become a carousel of changing allegiances, where yesterday's enemy could be tomorrow's. Allied merchants had no national loyalty whatsoever. They funded both sides, selling weapons to English garrisons and French rebels with equal enthusiasm. The war economy ran on betrayal, and betrayal had become so common that it was barely remarked upon. Now we come to the most controversial figure of the entire war, the teenage peasant girl whose story has been sanitized by centuries of hagiography and nationalist mythology. Joan of Arc, saint, heroine, martyr, and quite possibly the most manipulated individual in medieval history. The standard story is familiar. In 1429, 17-year-old Jeanne d'Arc arrived at the court of Charles VII in Chinon, claiming that the Archangel Michael, along with Saints Margaret and Catherine, had appeared to her and commanded her to drive the English from France and see Charles crowned at Rheims Cathedral. Against all odds, this illiterate peasant girl convinced the court, raised the siege of Orleans, and led a series of victories that turned the tide of the war. But here's what they don't tell you in the textbooks. Joan might have been the most carefully orchestrated political manipulation in medieval history. When Joan arrived at Chinon, Charles VII wasn't just losing the war, he was losing his very identity as king. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had declared him illegitimate, a bastard who had no right to the French throne. His own mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, had publicly questioned his parentage, suggesting he might be the son of one of her many lovers, rather than his supposed father. King Charles VI. The English controlled Paris, Normandy, and most of northern France. Charles's authority extended barely beyond the Loire Valley, and even there, many nobles treated him more like a pretender than a king. Charles needed more than military victory. He needed legitimacy, divine approval, something to prove that God favored his cause over that of the English king. And then, as if in answer to his prayers, appeared this peasant girl claiming direct communication with heaven itself. Was Joan's mission genuine religious inspiration, or was she a carefully crafted political tool? The evidence suggests something more complex and disturbing than either simple explanation. Joan's voices told her things that were remarkably convenient for Charles's political needs. They confirmed his legitimacy, commanded his coronation at Rheims, and promised divine support for his cause. For a court desperate for credibility, Joan was nothing short of a political miracle. But the manipulation went deeper than simple exploitation of religious enthusiasm. Joan's rise was facilitated by powerful court figures who had every reason to want her to succeed. Yolande of Aragon, Charles's mother-in-law, was one of the most politically astute women of her generation. She controlled vast territories, commanded significant military resources, and had been working for years to build a coalition against English occupation. The Duke of Alencon, one of Charles's few reliable military commanders, immediately championed Joan's cause. So did the Count of Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, and one of France's most experienced soldiers. These weren't men given to believing in peasant visionaries. They were hard-headed political operators who saw in Joan exactly what they needed: a symbol that could unite French resistance and provide religious justification for continued warfare. Joan's famous recognition of Charles at Chinon, where she supposedly picked him out from among his courtiers, despite never having seen him before, was almost certainly staged. Charles's appearance was well known. He was notably ugly, with a prominent nose and weak chin that made him instantly recognizable. More importantly, Joan had been coached during her journey to Chinon by supporters who had every reason to ensure her mission succeeded. The secret she revealed to Charles in their private conversation, which supposedly convinced him of her divine mission, probably concerned his legitimacy. Joan's voices had conveniently confirmed that he was indeed the rightful king, born in wedlock and blessed by God. For a man tormented by doubts about his parentage, this assurance was worth its weight in gold. But Joan's usefulness had limits. and those limits were becoming apparent by 1430. She had fulfilled her primary purpose. Charles had been crowned at Reims, and French morale had been restored. The military situation had stabilized, and the English were on the defensive. But Joan was also becoming a problem. Her claim to direct divine communication was dangerous to the established order. If God spoke to peasant girls, what did that say about the authority of kings and bishops? Joan's insistence on leading military campaigns personally challenged traditional gender roles and noble privilege. Her growing independence and willingness to criticize Charles's policies made her a potential threat, rather than merely a useful tool. Her capture at Compiègne in May 1430 raises disturbing questions that historians have been reluctant to address directly. Joan was abandoned by French forces who could have rescued her. The attack that led to her capture was poorly planned and executed, almost as if someone wanted her to be taken. Some French commanders seemed notably reluctant to risk themselves in attempts to save her. The reaction of Charles VII to Joan's capture tells us everything we need to know about how the French court really viewed her. This was the king who owed his crown to a peasant girl's divine mission, who had watched her raise sieges and win battles through faith alone. Yet when she was captured, Charles made no serious attempt to ransom her, mounted no diplomatic efforts to save her, organized no rescue attempts. Compare this to how medieval rulers typically responded when valuable allies were captured. When Duke Charles of Orleans was taken at Agincourt, the English held him for 25 years because the French were willing to pay enormous ransoms. When Jean the Fearless was killed in 1419, his son Philip immediately allied with England to avenge his death. But when Joan was captured, the French response was deafening silence. There's a simple explanation for this indifference. Joan had outlived her usefulness. She had crowned Charles at Reims, restored French morale, and provided religious legitimacy for the war effort. But a living saint is harder to control than a martyred one, and Joan's growing independence was becoming problematic for royal authority. Her trial and execution became the ultimate betrayal, but not in the way most people understand it. Yes, the English burned her as a heretic, but they had French collaborators every step of the way. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who presided over her trial, was French. The University of Paris, which provided the theological justification for her condemnation, was French. Most of the judges who sentenced her were French clerics who served English interests, but they were still French. The trial itself was a masterpiece of medieval legal corruption. The charges against Joan were carefully crafted to make her execution inevitable, while providing legal cover for everyone involved. She was accused of heresy for claiming direct divine revelation, of blasphemy for wearing men's clothing, of witchcraft for her military successes. The evidence was manufactured, the witnesses were coached, and the outcome was predetermined. But here's the most disturbing part. Joan's execution served French interests as much as English ones. A martyred Joan was far more valuable to French propaganda than a living one who might continue to make inconvenient demands or challenge royal authority. Her death transformed her from a problematic ally into a perfect symbol, pure, innocent, and safely dead. Within months of her execution, French propagandists were using Joan's martyrdom to rally support against the English. She became the ultimate proof of English cruelty and French righteousness. Her trial was portrayed as a travesty of justice, her judges as corrupt collaborators, her death as the murder of an innocent saint. The very people who had abandoned her in life now claimed her in death. Charles VII eventually ordered a retrial in 1455 that declared Joan's original condemnation invalid. This wasn't an act of belated justice. It was a political necessity. By then, Charles had expelled the English from most of France and needed to consolidate his victory by rehabilitating the symbol who had started his comeback. Joan's posthumous vindication served the same political purpose as her original mission, legitimizing Charles's rule and demonizing his enemies. The tragic irony is that Joan probably was genuinely inspired by religious faith and patriotic fervor. Her letters show a sincere belief in her divine mission and genuine concern for the suffering of ordinary French people. But sincere faith made her more useful, not less, to the political manipulators who shaped her destiny. They didn't create her visions, but they certainly exploited them. And when she became inconvenient, they abandoned her to a death that served their purposes better than her life ever could. Joan of Arc became a saint, but not before she was sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. Her story isn't just about religious faith or patriotic heroism. It's about how power uses idealism, how politics corrupts everything it touches, and how even the most sincere believers can become pawns in games they don't understand. To understand how betrayal became the dominant currency of the 100 Years' War, we need to examine the political masterpiece that was the Duchy of Burgundy under Philip the Good and his successors. This wasn't just a medieval state. It was a criminal enterprise masquerading as a kingdom where loyalty was systematically monetized and betrayal elevated to statecraft. His court at Dijon became the center of a web of corruption that stretched from London to Constantinople, where information was bought and sold, where military campaigns were financed by enemy gold, and where the line between diplomacy and espionage disappeared entirely. Philip the Good didn't just rule Burgundy. He created a parallel power structure that operated independently of both France and England while playing both sides against each other. The Burgundian system worked like this. Philip maintained official alliances with major powers, while secretly negotiating with their enemies. Traditional medieval rule depended on personal bonds between lord and vassal, sealed by oaths of fealty and maintained through honor. Philip replaced this with a bureaucratic system based on contracts, salaries, and performance incentives. His nobles weren't feudal vassals. They were employees who could be hired, fired, and replaced based on results. And Philip's forces participated in the French attempt to retake this crucial English stronghold. He recruited Swiss mercenaries, German artillery specialists, and English longbowmen, creating a truly international army, bound together not by patriotism, but by professional pride and regular pay. Other rulers began adopting similar approaches, replacing feudal loyalty with contractual relationships, traditional diplomacy with intelligence operations, and military service with professional mercenaries. The romantic ideals of medieval knighthood were gradually replaced by the cold calculations of political realism. His mercenary armies, so effective against traditional feudal forces, couldn't cope with Swiss tactical innovations and fanatical determination. At the Battle of Nancy in 1477, Charles died fighting desperately to rally troops who were already calculating the best terms for surrender. His forces were more disciplined and better equipped than any traditional feudal army, but they were also completely mercenary in their outlook. When loyalty becomes a commodity, it can always be outbid. When soldiers fight for money rather than honor, they'll abandon lost causes to preserve their investment. When diplomacy becomes a marketplace, trust becomes impossible, and alliances become temporary conveniences. The Italian Wars, the Habsburg-Valois conflict, the 30 Years' War, all featured the same patterns of shifting alliances, mercenary armies, and diplomatic double-dealing that Philip the Good had perfected during the 100 Years' War. The medieval world of honor and loyalty had died in the courts of Dijon and Brussels, replaced by a modern world of interests and calculation. When Philip allied with England, his commanders fought enthusiastically for English victory. Even after officially reconciling with Charles VII, Philip continued to finance both Armagnac and opposition forces, ensuring that France remained weak and divided. The great experiment in monetized loyalty had failed, brought down by its own internal contradictions. But the lessons of Burgundian statecraft lived on, adopted by emerging nation-states that learned to combine traditional patriotism with Burgundian professionalism, feudal loyalty with bureaucratic efficiency. He would fund rebellions against Charles, while publicly supporting royal authority, playing the role of loyal vassal while systematically undermining royal power. When he switched to France, the same men became equally enthusiastic French partisans. Their loyalty wasn't to any cause or country. It was to the Burgundian system that rewarded success and punished failure. But privately, Burgundian agents were selling intelligence to the English garrison, providing information about French troop movements, siege plans, and supply routes. When the siege failed, both sides paid Philip, the French for his military support, the English for his intelligence services. He dreamed of creating a middle kingdom between France and Germany, a new state that would dominate European politics through superior organization and financial resources. His court became a finishing school for ambitious nobles from across Europe who came to learn the Burgundian arts of political manipulation and military entrepreneurship. His ambassadors carried contradictory instructions: one set of orders for public consumption, another for private negotiations. Philip had discovered that neutrality was more profitable than commitment, that playing multiple sides was safer than choosing one. He created a model that would be copied by later rulers and eventually become the foundation of Renaissance diplomacy. His merchants traded with everyone while his spies gathered intelligence that was sold to the highest bidder. His military commanders fought for whoever paid best, regardless of official alliance structures. Consider the Siege of Calais in 1436. Officially, Burgundy was allied with France under the Treaty of Arras. This wasn't simple corruption. It was systematic manipulation of the medieval alliance system. But Philip's greatest innovation was the way he managed internal loyalty within his own domains. This transformation had profound implications for the broader conflict. Burgundian nobles had no emotional attachment to either France or England. They served whoever offered better career prospects. The most cynical example of this approach was Philip's management of the ongoing civil war in France between different noble factions. Philip's son, Charles the Bold, took this system to its logical extreme. Charles commissioned the most advanced military technology of his time, hiring Italian engineers to design siege weapons and fortifications. The Burgundian model spread like a virus through medieval Europe, but the system contained the seeds of its own destruction. Charles the Bold learned this lesson the hard way during his disastrous wars against the Swiss Confederation in the 1470s. The fall of Burgundy marked the end of an era in medieval politics. The legacy of Burgundian betrayal can be seen in every major European conflict that followed. While knights and nobles were playing their games of shifting loyalty, a different class was quietly profiting from the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Merchants, bankers, and military contractors discovered that prolonged conflict created unprecedented opportunities for those willing to abandon national loyalty in favor of profit maximization. They didn't just adapt to the war economy, they helped create it, transforming medieval commerce into a sophisticated system for monetizing violence and political instability. The great banking houses of Florence, the Medici, Bardi, Peruzzi, and Ascioli, maintained branches in both London and Paris throughout the conflict, carefully financing both sides while taking no political position beyond profit maximization. This wasn't simple opportunism. It was a conscious business strategy based on the recognition that prolonged conflict was more profitable than decisive victory. His bank maintained extensive operations in England, providing loans to English kings and investing in English wool exports. Hawkwood fought for Florence against Milan, then switched to fighting for Milan against Florence, then offered his services to the Pope against both city-states. His loyalty lasted exactly as long as his current contract, and he was quite open about the commercial nature of his military service. The merchant adventurers of London maintained trading relationships with French ports, even during active warfare, paying customs duties to French authorities while their home country was trying to conquer those same territories. English artillery innovations were quickly copied by French manufacturers and sold back to French armies. French developments in small firearms found their way into English hands through commercial networks that operated independently of official diplomatic channels. Shipbuilders maintained contracts with multiple navies, often building identical vessels for opposing fleets. Merchant houses maintained correspondence networks that stretched across Europe, providing real-time information about political developments, military movements, and economic conditions. This information was valuable to anyone willing to pay for it, regardless of political allegiance. Pirates and privateers switched between legitimate commerce and sanctioned piracy, depending on which offered better returns. A sane captain who attacked French shipping under English letters of marque might be found a few months later raiding English vessels under French authority. Traditional feudal obligations were gradually replaced by contractual relationships based on monetary payments. Mercenary armies had no interest in decisive battles that might end their employment, leading to elaborate campaigns designed more to generate fees than achieve military objectives. Knights became professional soldiers who served for wages rather than honor. Cities that refused to pay tribute faced systematic destruction designed to encourage future compliance. The medieval concept of non-combatant immunity gradually disappeared as military entrepreneurs recognized that terror was a profitable business strategy. Armies became businesses that had to show profit to survive. The Abbey of St. Denis lent money to both French and English armies, securing their investments with territorial pledges from both sides. I serve whoever pays best and provides the most interesting challenges. The same smiths who forged English longbows also crafted French crossbow bolts. Their commercial agents reported not just on market conditions, but on political developments, military preparations, and diplomatic negotiations. This intelligence was then sold to various clients, often including parties on opposite sides of the same conflict. Papal bankers managed financial transactions for opposing armies, ensuring that religious authority remained neutral while religious money flowed to whoever offered the best security for loans. Gunpowder merchants sold to both sides, sometimes delivering to opposing armies on the same day. Master James of St. Omer built defensive works for English garrisons in Normandy, while simultaneously providing French forces with detailed plans of those same fortifications. This wasn't considered shameful or treacherous. It was recognized as professional competence. Hawkwood died wealthy and respected, his military skills valued precisely because they were available to the highest bidder. These men recognized that their services were valuable to anyone willing to pay, regardless of nationality or political allegiance. Flemish cloth merchants sold to both English and French armies, often delivering supplies to opposing forces on the same day. Simultaneously, Medici agents in France were financing French military campaigns and investing in French luxury goods production. When English armies attacked French positions, they were often financed by the same banking house that was funding French defensive preparations. Consider the operations of Cosimo de' Medici during the 1440s and 1450s. The Medici weren't unique in this approach. But the real masters of war profiteering were the military contractors, condottieri, mercenary captains, and weapons dealers who transformed warfare from a feudal obligation into a commercial enterprise. Sir John Hawkwood, the famous English condottiere who operated primarily in Italy, provides a perfect example of this new breed of military entrepreneur. When asked why he changed sides so frequently, Hawkwood's response was straightforward. "I am a man of war, and war is my trade." The weapons trade operated on similar principles. Armorer workshops in Milan, Augsburg, and Paris produced high-quality equipment for export to anyone willing to pay premium prices. This created absurd situations where military technology spread rapidly across political boundaries because profit motives trumped strategic considerations. The most cynical operators were the siege specialists, engineers who designed and built fortifications for one side, while secretly gathering intelligence about defensive weaknesses that they sold to potential attackers. Naval warfare became equally commercialized. Even more sophisticated were the intelligence networks that developed around commercial operations. The Fugger banking house of Augsburg created perhaps the most sophisticated intelligence operation of the medieval period. Religious institutions participated enthusiastically in these commercial networks. Monasteries and cathedral chapters invested in military contractors and weapons manufacturers, viewing warfare as just another economic sector with promising returns. The papacy itself became deeply involved in war finance, issuing bonds to fund various military campaigns while maintaining diplomatic relations with all parties. This commercialization of warfare had profound consequences for medieval society. The human cost of this transformation was enormous. Prolonged conflicts became more profitable than quick victories, creating incentives to maintain wars rather than resolve them. Civilian populations bore the brunt of this commercialized warfare. Armies that lived off the land had economic incentives to maximize pillaging and minimize protection of non-combatants. By the 1440s, the accumulated weight of a century of betrayals had fundamentally altered the political landscape of both England and France. What had begun as a dynastic dispute had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval history, a conflict where traditional concepts of loyalty, honor, and legitimacy had been so thoroughly corrupted that they no longer provided any foundation for stable government. In England, the consequences of systematic betrayal were becoming catastrophically apparent. York's descent from Edward III through both paternal and maternal lines gave him genealogical superiority over the Lancastrian line, which descended through John of Gaunt, Edward III's fourth son. But instead of resolving this succession question through negotiation or legal procedures, England's nobles chose civil war. But more importantly, it demonstrated how the methods that had brought short-term success against France guaranteed long-term disaster at home. The same brutal efficiency that had conquered Normandy and Gascony was turned against English towns and castles. The same mercenary mentality that had characterized English armies in France infected English politics, creating a generation of leaders who valued victory above stability and personal advancement above national welfare. Edward spent his reign managing noble factions rather than governing the kingdom, distributing offices and revenues to maintain temporary coalitions that shifted with each new crisis. The kingdom that had seemed on the verge of dissolution in 1429 was using the lessons of the 100 Years' War to create the most powerful centralized state in medieval Europe. Instead of allowing noble factions to compete for royal authority, they used the threat of betrayal to justify the systematic destruction of independent noble power. But Louis's treachery was different from the opportunistic betrayals that had characterized earlier phases of the war. His betrayals were systematic, calculated to strengthen royal authority rather than merely advance personal interests. The same accusations of treasonous conspiracy that had destabilized England became tools for French royal consolidation. But French success came not from rejecting the culture of betrayal that had characterized the conflict. It came from systematically applying that culture to eliminate internal enemies and consolidate royal power. Louis bribed Swiss cantons to resist Burgundian expansion, supported urban revolts against Burgundian authority, and provided intelligence to anyone willing to fight against Charles. For the first time since the beginning of the 100 Years' War, France had achieved genuine political unity under royal authority that couldn't be challenged by external manipulation. The same international networks that had made Burgundy powerful became vulnerabilities that Louis could exploit. The kingdom that emerged from the 100 Years' War bore no resemblance to the feudal monarchy that had entered it. They became courtiers whose survival depended entirely on royal favor, competing for offices and pensions rather than maintaining independent power bases. The proud feudal warriors who had characterized medieval France became decorative appendages to royal authority. Royal authority now depended on systematic surveillance, preventive arrests, and the elimination of potential threats before they could organize effective resistance. Louis had proven that centralized treachery was more effective than decentralized treachery, that state-sponsored betrayal could defeat entrepreneurial betrayal. The same techniques that medieval rulers had used against foreign enemies were now applied systematically against domestic subjects. The same mercenary mentality that had made Burgundian armies effective made them unreliable when facing sustained pressure and uncertain pay. The English state became a protection racket where noble families paid for security through political support rather than legal taxation. When Charles the Bold inherited Burgundy in 1467, he represented the same kind of threat to French unity that earlier Burgundian dukes had posed, an independent power capable of playing multiple sides and maintaining effective independence from royal authority. The kingdom that had dominated European politics under Edward III and Henry V was collapsing from within, torn apart by the very methods that had initially brought success. But Edward discovered that ruling England required different skills than conquering it. The same noble families who had supported his claim expected to be rewarded with power and resources, creating a system where royal authority depended entirely on satisfying competing demands for advancement. The English nobility had learned too well the lessons of the 100 Years' War, that loyalty was negotiable, that kings could be made and unmade through conspiracy, and that political success belonged to those willing to break any oath for advantage. The Wars of the Roses were not just a consequence of losing in France. They were the inevitable result of a political culture that had embraced betrayal as standard practice. When Henry VI suffered his first mental breakdown in 1453, the same year that marked the end of English hopes in France, competing noble factions didn't seek to support royal authority through temporary regency arrangements. Instead, they saw opportunity for permanent power grabs. They had spent a century learning that political problems were solved through violence, that legal claims meant nothing without military force to back them up, and that destroying your enemies was safer than making peace with them. Richard, Duke of York, had a stronger claim to the throne than Henry VI, and everyone in the English political establishment knew it. The decision to fight rather than negotiate reflected how completely the English political class had internalized the lessons of the 100 Years' War. A Battle of St. Albans in 1455 marked the beginning of 30 years of intermittent civil war that would devastate England as ruling class and eliminate any possibility of renewed intervention in France. The English nobility applied continental warfare tactics to domestic politics with predictably catastrophic results. Edward IV's usurpation in 1461 followed the pattern established during the French Wars, a combination of genealogical claims, military force, and systematic betrayal of existing loyalties. The result was political instability that made effective government impossible. Meanwhile, in France, a very different transformation was taking place. Charles VII and his successors learned from English mistakes. Louis XI, who ruled France from 1461 to 1483, became known as the Spider King for his mastery of political intrigue and systematic betrayal. Louis's treatment of the Duke of Burgundy provides the perfect example of this approach. Instead of attempting military conquest, which had failed repeatedly against Burgundian resources, Louis applied political pressure systematically designed to isolate Charles from potential allies and force him into unsustainable military commitments. The brilliance of this strategy was that it used Charles's own methods against him. When Charles the Bold died at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, his death marked more than the end of Burgundian independence. It demonstrated the triumph of systematic royal betrayal over anarchic noble betrayal. The incorporation of Burgundian territories into France eliminated the last major independent power capable of playing England against France. But the price of this unity was the complete transformation of French political culture. Louis XI created the foundations of the modern surveillance state, using networks of informants, secret police, and administrative bureaucracy to monitor and control noble behavior. The French nobility learned to survive in this environment by abandoning any pretense of independent political authority. The final phase of the 100 Years' War, from 1449 to 1453, witnessed betrayals so systematic and comprehensive that they transformed military conquest into political theater. This wasn't warfare in any traditional sense. It was a carefully orchestrated series of business transactions where English strongholds were sold rather than captured, where garrisons surrendered without fighting, and where 3 centuries of English rule in France ended not with heroic last stands, but with negotiated capitulations. This was the capital of English Normandy, the administrative center of 3 centuries of English rule, defended by strong walls and an experienced garrison. Traditional military logic suggested a long siege would be necessary to reduce such a fortress. Instead, the city fell after barely a month of negotiations. He had fulfilled his contractual obligations to England as long as England fulfilled its obligations to him. Those who accepted were treated generously, retaining their lands and positions under French sovereignty. Those who refused found themselves isolated, abandoned by their former colleagues, and facing inevitable military defeat without support. When those payments stopped, so did his loyalty. This wasn't personal animosity or political conversion. It was professional reassessment based on changing market conditions. Charles VII didn't just defeat the English militarily. He bought them out, using a combination of French gold, political pressure, and systematic corruption to turn English commanders into French agents. Somerset commanded not just the garrison of Rouen, but the entire English administrative apparatus in Normandy. The capture of Bordeaux in 1451 was accomplished primarily through the defection of key garrison commanders who had been convinced that English rule was ending, and that accommodation with France offered better prospects than feudal resistance. Cherbourg surrendered without a siege when French agents convinced the garrison that resistance was futile and profitable cooperation was available. Talbot attacked a French position that had been carefully prepared with artillery and defensive works, apparently believing that English military superiority would overcome French tactical advantages. His defeat wasn't just military. It was symbolic proof that English methods were obsolete and French innovation had triumphed. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, landed with a small army and initially achieved remarkable success, retaking Bordeaux and several other key positions. These networks were systematically infiltrated and destroyed by French intelligence services that had learned from decades of English occupation how to identify and eliminate potential threats to political stability. But their English background made them permanent suspects in French eyes, never fully trusted despite their protestations of newfound loyalty. They lived as internal exiles in their own homes, neither fully English nor acceptably French. When English rule ended in France, thousands of English settlers were left to fend for themselves. Families who had lived in Normandy and Gascony for generations suddenly found themselves foreigners in their own homes, subject to French rule without any protection from their former government. Entire communities were destroyed, cultural traditions were eliminated, and individual lives were shattered by the systematic application of political calculation to human relationships. But Talbot's victories depended on popular Gascon support that evaporated as soon as French counterpressure was applied. But the triumph of a new form of political organization based on systematic betrayal and state-sponsored manipulation. The medieval world of honor, loyalty, and feudal obligation had been replaced by a modern world of interests, calculation, and bureaucratic efficiency. The English garrison had held this strategic port for over 30 years, controlling access to the Seine and serving as the primary link between England and its Norman territories. The fortress was impregnable to direct assault and could be supplied indefinitely by English naval power. By year, Coutances and Saint-Lay fell like dominoes as English resistance collapsed from within. Individual commanders like Somerset managed to arrange personal accommodation with French authority, but ordinary English colonists, merchants, and administrators were abandoned without recourse. Their property was confiscated, their political rights were terminated, and their cultural identity was erased. Gough had concluded that English rule in France was doomed, and that personal survival required accommodation with French victory. His surrender of Harfleur was accompanied by his enrollment in French service, where he continued his military career under new management. He controlled tax collection, military recruitment, and diplomatic relations with local Norman nobles. His defection didn't just open one city, it collapsed the entire English position in Normandy. The reconquest of Normandy and Gascony resembled less a military campaign than a corporate takeover, where existing management was either bought off or replaced through hostile acquisition. Gascony had been English territory longer than Normandy, and many Gascon nobles had genuine loyalty to English rule based on centuries of profitable collaboration. The fall of Rouen in 1449 set the pattern for everything that followed. The English commander, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had been in secret communication with French agents for over a year before the siege began. The English government owed him enormous sums in back pay and military expenses. His requests for reinforcements had been ignored for years, leaving his forces undermanned and under-equipped. Meanwhile, French agents offered immediate payment of his debts, recognition of his military competence, and promises of high position in the new French administration of Normandy. Somerset's betrayal was motivated by a combination of personal ambition and practical calculation. For Somerset, switching sides wasn't betrayal, it was sound business practice. The pattern repeated across Normandy with remarkable consistency. English commanders received French offers that combined immediate financial rewards with long-term career security. Caen fell after token resistance when its English garrison learned that their commander had already negotiated surrender terms. The most cynical betrayal occurred at Harfleur, the fortress that had been Henry V's first major conquest in 1415. But the garrison commander, Sir Matthew Gough, had been conducting secret negotiations with French representatives for months before the siege began. The reconquest of Gascony followed the same pattern, though with additional complications created by the region's complex relationship with both English and French authority. But even in Gascony, systematic French bribery and political pressure proved more effective than military conquest. The brief English attempt to reconquer Gascony in 1452-1453 demonstrated how completely the political foundation of English rule had collapsed. The Battle of Castellon in 1453, where Talbot was killed and English hopes finally ended, wasn't a heroic last stand. It was a military disaster caused by political miscalculation. But the most devastating betrayal of the war's final phase was England's abandonment of its own people. The English government made no systematic effort to evacuate these populations or negotiate for their safety. Some English settlers attempted to maintain their identity and loyalty despite French conquest, creating underground networks of resistance and communication with England. Others attempted to accommodate themselves to French rule through conversion of loyalty and adoption of French identity. The human cost of political betrayal extended far beyond the noble families and military commanders who made the strategic decisions. The end of the 100 Years' War marked not just the conclusion of a military conflict. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a series of battles. It was a transformative political experiment that fundamentally altered the nature of European civilization. What began as a traditional dynastic dispute evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a systematic exploration of how far political betrayal could be pushed before it destroyed the very foundations of organized society. The systematic manipulation of loyalty, the calculated sacrifice of allies, and the transformation of honor from a sacred obligation into a negotiable commodity created a new form of political organization that would dominate European development for centuries. The greatest weapon of this war wasn't the longbow or the cannon. It was betrayal itself. The lessons learned during this century of conflict weren't primarily military or technological. They were political and psychological. Rulers learned that loyalty could be bought, that treaties were temporary conveniences, and that even divine mission could be manipulated for political gain. The medieval world of personal honor and feudal loyalty was destroyed, replaced by a system where survival depended entirely on correctly calculating the intentions of superiors, who were themselves engaged in systematic deception. Trust became impossible, alliances became temporary, and political relationships became purely transactional. Her martyrdom was not an accident or enemy action. It was the inevitable result of a political system that treated human idealism as a consumable resource. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he corrupted them, turning English commanders into French agents and transforming military conquest into political conversion. Having learned that loyalty was negotiable and kings could be made and unmade through conspiracy, English nobles applied these lessons domestically during the Wars of the Roses. Administrative surveillance and the assumption that all political relationships were temporary arrangements subject to modification based on changing interests. The romantic ideals of medieval knighthood were replaced by the cold calculations of Renaissance statecraft. The result was 3 decades of civil war that eliminated most of England's medieval nobility and established royal authority through terror rather than consent. That internal enemies were more dangerous than external ones, and that political survival required the systematic elimination of potential threats before they could organize effective resistance. The 100 Years' War provided one answer: that systematic betrayal can triumph over traditional loyalty, but only by destroying the moral foundations that make political community possible. We inherited a world where loyalty is always suspect, where trust is always provisional, and where the greatest political skill is the ability to betray effectively while maintaining the appearance of honor. Whether that transformation represented progress or catastrophe remains an open question, but there is no doubt that the world that emerged from the 100 Years' War was fundamentally different from the one that entered it. The greatest victories weren't won on battlefields, but in palace chambers where loyalty was purchased and honor was abandoned. And the ultimate casualties weren't the soldiers who died in combat, but the ideals that died in the corridors of power, sacrificed on the altar of political necessity and buried in the foundations of the modern state. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The founders of democratic institutions understood that systematic betrayal was the greatest threat to political stability and designed systems intended to make such betrayal impossible, or at least detectable. It achieves political objectives, eliminates enemies, and creates stable authority. But it does so by destroying everything that makes political life worth living: trust, honor, loyalty, and the possibility of genuine human community based on shared values rather than calculated interests. His success established the model for early modern statecraft, where diplomatic manipulation was more important than military force. We live in a world where political loyalty is understood to be conditional, where leaders are expected to prioritize national interests over personal relationships, where diplomatic deception is considered normal, and where the capacity for strategic betrayal is viewed as evidence of political competence. More importantly, they learned that systematic betrayal was more effective than random treachery, that state-sponsored manipulation could triumph over individual opportunism. They established the principle that commercial relationships should transcend political boundaries, that profit maximization justified any form of collaboration, and that market forces were more powerful than national loyalty. Entire communities were destroyed, cultural traditions were eliminated, and individual lives were shattered by the systematic application of political calculation to human relationships. The English settlers abandoned in France, the French nobles eliminated by royal suspicion, the common soldiers betrayed by their commanders. These forgotten victims paid the real price of political innovation. The Spider King, demonstrated that centralized treachery was more effective than decentralized treachery, that royal betrayal could eliminate noble betrayal by making independent political action impossible. Charles VII became King of France not through military victory, but through superior understanding of how to use betrayal systematically. Louis XI perfected this system, creating the foundations of the modern surveillance state through networks of informants, secret police, and administrative bureaucracy. But the price of this political evolution was enormous. The English discovered the ultimate consequence of embracing betrayal as political method. Joan of Arc became the perfect symbol of this transformation, a sincere believer, manipulated by political operators who used her faith for their own purposes and abandoned her when she became inconvenient. The merchants and military contractors who profited from the conflict created the foundation of modern capitalism, discovering that prolonged instability was more profitable than stable peace. The human cost of this transformation extended far beyond the battlefield casualties that historians traditionally count. What emerged from the Hundred Years' War wasn't just French victory and English defeat. It was a new form of civilization based on systematic mistrust. The war established patterns that would dominate European politics for centuries. The principle that state interests transcended moral obligations, that diplomatic manipulation was preferable to military force. Modern democracy, with its emphasis on checks and balances, separation of powers, and constitutional limitations on government authority, developed as a direct response to the political innovations of the Hundred Years' War. But the legacy of the Hundred Years' War extends beyond institutional arrangements into the fundamental assumptions of modern political culture. The question raised by this century of conflict remains relevant today. How much betrayal can a political system absorb before it loses the capacity to inspire genuine loyalty and legitimate authority? The true legacy of this conflict isn't the rise of France or the decline of England. It's the birth of modern political cynicism and the death of medieval idealism. Perhaps that's the most disturbing lesson of the Hundred Years' War, that betrayal works. The war that began with a dispute over royal succession ended with the triumph of a new form of political organization that would shape human civilization for centuries. In the end, the most important battles of this conflict weren't fought with weapons, but with words, promises, and bags of gold.